And then, of course, we go hopping rocks back through the Jungle Brook part. That's why we named it Jungle Brook, because there's so many little brooks and then so many big boulders to hop over. And we children used to, when my brothers and sisters and all cousins and us would get here, we'd see how long we could stay off of the ground without stepping on the dirt. This is a log cabin that my grandparent Ogles owned, and of course they built. And we called it, they first built the first house when they first married, and as their family got larger, they built the other one, and we always used to call it this house in the t'other. So Granny would say, go over in the t'other house and get me this or that. And then when kith and kin came, the whole place was loaded with people, and Granny would let me sleep in this bed, and you'd have to get in on this end, and I could look out the one little window and look out over the mountains down, and I'd wonder what all in the world it could be for little folks like me out over those mountains. And then I could see the lightning as it flashed and watch storms go by. Then when I was about 14-year-old, I guess, I was getting close to 16, we lived up here, and then it was a bear back of our, when we went out to milk, there's a big old bear there, and I said, Dad, I didn't know you'd bought a black calf, and he looked up and he says, it's not, and says it's coming out the cow. So he took the cow and put her in the stable, and we run to the house, and then he got his bear dogs and went over and got a neighbor, and they took off after it and run it back on top of Bullhead Mountain. But then the next weekend, when we were coming in, why this bunch of boys with their hound dogs and the guns and everything coming in across through the Sugarland Gap, and they came in there toward our house, and the boy come up, the young fella came up the door, and I said, Wiley, where did you see that bear here? We're thinking about having us a race. So the next week, Crockett Maples brought me a letter. Our mailman brought me a letter from Ernest, and he said he kept bothering the mailman, wanting to know what Wiley Oakley's oldest daughter name was, and so he finally wrote me a letter, and Dad said, you can't be writing them Sugarland boys, you're too young. But I kid afterwards and say, that's how I met Ernest. He come a bear hunting and found a deer instead of a bear, and that was dear me. Here we have the remains of the little honeymoon house. When the eldest of the family would marry, they built him a home back here. And later, when the next one to marry, then he moved back, and that one had to go hunt him another place. Till there was, I believe, 4 or 5 of the boys and my uncles, but Mom didn't get to live here. She had to go with Dad to his family, so we had to move back up on Piney Mountain. That's over in that direction. Oh, several miles, about 3 miles back in there, and that was back and beyond. But of course, and that's what we call where Dad used to say we lived at Scratch Britches Mountain. But then later we moved back here closer to Granny's. That was when I was older. Granny and us would start out early in the spring. You know, you didn't have too much green things during the winter. So as early as we could in the spring, we'd start out to find what we could to eat, you know, and make as we say, a mess of greens. And there's a different kind of mess that was all mixed up, the reason we called it a mess. She'd pick out to show us the things to stoop and cut with an old knife that Grandpap Ogle had made years ago. And we'd get down and cut all these little green shoots, and it was fascinating. By the time that apron lamp was good and full, and we had a plenty to cook when we got in. Of course, we'd gather a little bit of the little tender shoots of dock and plantain, field cress, dandelion, greens. But now, when we gather poke, we usually use that as a separate dish. When we went out with Granny, we had enough to do quite a few people before we got back home. We'd go in the woods, and then we'd go along the streams, and then we'd go into the fields. And by the time we got home, we had quite a bit for everybody and the neighbors. I said I'd hop rocks and played here so much. It was one of the happiest times of my life.